here at the Beaver Creek Chamber of Commerce to record an oral history of the 1974 tornado that struck Xenia. My name is Mary McKinley, and I am the Public Outreach Program Coordinator for the Greene County Record Center and Archives. I am here today with Mark Buckwalter, who is the Senior Judge of the Greene County Court of Common Pleas. Could you tell me a little bit about where you grew up?
Yes, I grew up in Greene County. I've been a lifelong resident of Greene County, born in Xenia at Greene Memorial Hospital. And then my family were farmers on the eastern edge of Greene County, eastern south edge of Greene County. Eventually we moved into town in the 60s and went to Xenia schools. My mother worked in downtown Xenia. My father worked outside on Ledbetter Road in Xenia proper. And that's where I grew up and ultimately graduated from high school.
Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood in Xenia?
Sure. It was a big difference moving from the farm where we had no neighbors to town. Probably better actually for us because I was only 6 years old maybe when we moved to town, and so we moved into a plat called South Hill, which obviously is south of Xenia but still in Xenia proper. And there were a lot of other kids our age, so a lot of kids to play with. Went to an elementary school called Spring Hill, and it was a good childhood, good people to live with. Ultimately after Spring Hill, which was to 6th grade, then we went to Central Junior High, which at the time before the tornado was located right in downtown Xenia. Actually now where the Senior Citizens Center is, on I believe that's Market Street, and went to Central for 3 years, and then in 10th grade started Xenia High School, which at that time was on Edison Boulevard, and got through sophomore year, and then in my junior year is when the great tornado of '74 hit and destroyed all the schools I just mentioned. All of them were leveled.
So you were a junior. How old were you when that happened?
Just turned 17.
Can you walk me through that day, starting in the morning?
Sure. Went to school that day. It was Wednesday, as I recall. Went to school, normal day at school, and no indications at all that we were going to have the weather we had. Little warm for April 3rd, which we welcomed. And then we got out of school, buses took us back to South Hill. We got out of school, I believe at about 3:30 p.m. And I got home, and my mom was still at work right in downtown Xenia. And then I think it was around 4 p.m. where we started getting interruptions in the news, which was extremely rare back then. But Gil Whitney was the weatherman, and he'll be the one, you'll hear that name echoed many times. He was the one that first came on warning people that there's just been an unprecedented outbreak of tornadoes in the southwest heading towards Ohio, and then even closer to Ohio in this Miami Valley. And then I'd say maybe 15 minutes later, he comes on again, and this may have been around 4:15, saying that tornadoes have been spotted headed for the general Xenia, Greene County area, but still not quite pinpointing Xenia proper. And then about, I'd say 4:30, it came on again, and there were no, of course, tornado warnings or anything back then, and nor cell phones or anything to communicate with masses. Came on again and said, take cover, there's a tornado barreling down right towards Xenia. And so at that time I called my mother, who was at work on Main Street in Xenia, and I was telling her about it, and she said, we're aware, the weather's really picking up here, it's getting bad. And then she said, here it is, and click, the phone went dead. And And so I thought, wow, this is bad. So I took the car and I drove down the most efficient route would be Detroit Street, and there was a tree down, and I thought, wow, this is a pretty bad storm. So I went around and went to Cincinnati Avenue, and there was a billboard down, and these blocked the roads, and I thought, this is really bad, but I didn't think anything of what it really turned out to be. So then I took US 35 bypass and drove right through Arrowhead, which was leveled, and I saw houses, literally houses on the highway, and tractor trailers turned over, on and on. And I finally got driving both sides of the highway. I got to 35, headed to Xenia. I remember the state highway trooper couldn't go on the westbound lane, so he was on my lane coming this way. I was coming this way, and we just flew right by each other. And then I had to park the car outside of Xenia because there was too much debris and cars and tractor trailers and things everywhere. And I took off running because I wanted to find my mom, and I ran down the hill of Main Street and had to crawl over all kinds of debris. Then right where the old Kroger's was, which now currently is one of the McDonald's in Xenia, and where there's the bike path crossing, was a railroad crossing. And there was a train, and the tornado had derailed the train. And so I had to crawl up the side of the train, climb over the side, and then jump down, and then kept on running, and finally got to where my mom worked. And Mr. Prindle, who ran a place called Famous Sporting Goods, knew my mom and said she's okay. A bunch of her fellow employees and she are trying to make it out of Xenia, but they're okay. And so once that was known, I knew my brothers and sisters were okay. One lived in Springfield and the other two were home. And I knew my father was okay. So at that point, being at that age, I thought, okay, I'm going to check this out. And then that's when the real odyssey began for me, because I was there within 5 minutes after the tornado hit.
Did you see anything left over in the sky when you were traveling?
When I was still in South Hill, I saw the sky as things that I've never seen before. There were like dark clouds doing somersaults over each other, and it seemed like they were only 100 feet in the air. And I could see what I thought was a really bad storm, but again, I had no idea the magnitude. But so then I thought, well, I'm going to walk straight to the high school and see what it did to Ed. And at that time is when I kind of had a wake-up call and a learning as to just what people look like who have suffered true shock. And we're talking, 3,000 people I probably saw, 2,000 at least, truly just zombified, walking around, totally in shock. Me too, for that matter. And I get to the high school, and it's leveled as well as Central. Every building is practically leveled. And then my friend Bob came, and he had a dune buggy. And back then they were made of Volkswagens, and the tires were made solidly of rubber. And he and I were the only ones who could get around in the city, because even the EMTs, the police, the firemen, they kept getting flat tires because of all the nails and debris. So Bob and I got in the Volkswagen and started trying to pull people out of rubble, take people to the hospital, to help the EMTs. And I think I did that for about 36 hours straight, which was an odyssey of itself. But a lot of the people that suffered and the greatest casualties were at the root beer stand and Trumbull Street, which I had already passed going down Detroit Street. And of course I didn't know that because so many people unfortunately were buried under the rubble.
Do you have any idea of how many people you helped that day?
Well, I'd say that day, coming into that night, then we took shelter in Bob's house that night because another tornado was coming. Then the next morning, I don't think I got any sleep. The next morning, I don't think a lot of people forget, we had a terrible snowfall. It wasn't a lot of accumulation, about an inch and a half, but no one was prepared for it. I didn't have any gloves. I just had probably tennis shoes, and still at that point, so I don't know if I could put a number on it, but helping people in general, I think it would be scores of people I'd like to think that we helped. And then it was a matter of searching, and just keep searching and searching and searching for bodies under the rubble. But by the next day, fortunately, I don't know that we had uncovered any more that next day. And I will say this, that night though, the night of the tornado, if I'm not mistaken, it was in Arrowhead, and it was pitch dark. Of course, there was no light, no artificial light, nothing. And all of a sudden, I just hear this, like the ground shaking, and this vroom, vroom, vroom. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes, I believe it was 3, just incredible spotlights out of the sky. And it was the Air National Guard. And they provided spotlights on us. And I remember thinking, this is a war zone. This is just a war zone here. Total devastation, especially in Arrowhead. All the houses almost were destroyed and flattened, not just, shingles off. And me trying, with Bob and my other buddy Vaughn, trying to help get people out and search for people. It was quite the experience.
I'm sure. So if we're going back to kind of when you first learned that the tornado was coming, your siblings were in the house with you.
Sister was, my brother just pulled up at about that time, yeah.
And you were on the phone with your mother, so you didn't actually take shelter. Is that accurate?
No, I didn't take shelter. I didn't appreciate what was coming at that time, but it had kind of missed South Hill, and the route that it was going then just went essentially straight into town, and then kind of pivoted and started going more north, and that's when it wiped out the high school, of course Central Junior High, all of those housing developments there. Stadium Heights was hit real hard, and then it headed, and there's a photograph I'm sure you've seen, I've got it here, a photograph straight for Greene Memorial Hospital, and fate or whatever, it turned, it didn't stop, but it turned and then started heading towards Central State. But where it hit in the high school, if it had hit an hour earlier, I can't imagine there being less than 1,000 casualties, if not more. In fact, because almost all the schools were devastated. So if it had hit an hour earlier, there would have been, I shudder to think how many people dead. There were already, 33 plus the 2 National Guardmen, or 34, but there would have been, I have to believe, hundreds and then thousands severely injured. But it fortunately didn't hit until after school was out and people had already dispersed.
Do you remember any of your siblings' reactions at the time?
They didn't know. My little sister was, she was very scared. My brother had not realized, because again, he didn't get it on, there wasn't on the radio or anything when he pulled up in his car, and I had taken his car to go to town to check on Mom and told him to watch my sister Lori. So they weren't really privy to the devastation that I was. But yeah, I think the thing that sticks with me most, or 2 things I guess. One is we went to the courthouse the next day, I think it was, and surveying the damage, and I looked into courtroom 1, which now I preside in as judge, and saw that it basically held up. The big, beautiful stained glass window in there, if you've ever been there, it's beautiful. It bowed, but it stayed intact. And the building itself was directly at point ground zero for the F5 to hit, and it stayed. It stayed, and that's where we have our emergency evaluation service now, is in the basement of the courthouse, or it was for years, because no other building in Greene County would be able to boast that it withstood the direct impact of an F5 tornado. And so even though all the windows were blown out, the clock on the bell tower was blown out, but I never thought I'd be presiding in that courtroom, but here I am. And then the other thing that stood out was, like I said, just anytime now when I see devastation on TV, I always hearken back to the fact that I know what it looks like to see thousands of people's faces that are wandering literally aimlessly at just what's just happened. What is happening? And the devastation of seeing a bus on top of a bus, and then maybe a car on the side of it, and all the unnatural phenomenon that you would see at Krollers. They had semi-trucks that were stacked on top of semi-trucks. And then you would see houses that were completely destroyed, but maybe there would be two-story houses. And yet there would be one room that was in a vacuum, and there would be papers on it and a pen, and it never disturbed. That was very common. You would see cars that were completely devastated, yet there was one over in a little pocket that was an air vacuum that was unscathed, no scratches or anything. So those are the things I remember about the phenomenon of it. And then people forget the terrible tragedy 2 days later when the two Army National Guardsmen died in a fire trying to keep warm at Cherry's Furniture, downtown Xenia. That would have been then, I think, the 5th of April. So that was insult to injury, and it really affected the psyche of Xenians, because not only are they still breathing this shock, but two people of the Army National Guards that tried to come and help us, then they die. So it was dark times.
You've said that you helped for many hours, many days after the fact. Do you remember anything in particular about the other people who joined you? You had a couple of friends. Did you meet any people then that you talked to in the aftermath?
Well, I immediately aftermath, it was police and EMTs, because we were the only ones that could get around. And then people would say, you got to go here, you got to go there, you got to go here, you got to go there. And we were running all over, trying to do whatever we could. The next day, I think it was more like, there's a section here in Lanewood, there's a section here in Stadium Heights, there's a section here in Arrowhead, meaning that hasn't been overturned yet, meaning the debris is still there, we don't know if there's anybody under. And so you had to keep pulling walls up and over, and anything, doors, to see, heaven forbid, if there was anyone there. Because again, that's what people did. They took cover and they went wherever they thought they could hide. And unfortunately, for those who didn't make it, they were almost all of them, I believe, were under rubble, and many were suffocated, unfortunately, trying to take care of their, I think, at least one or two babies. So yeah, but it was interesting for me because I was 17 and barely 17. And so I wasn't fully, like an adult, able to appreciate the devastation and the loss. Plus, we didn't have a body count either for I don't know how long. So it wasn't like I knew immediately after the tornado how many people died, how many people were injured. Quite frankly, I think everybody immediately thought it was going to be a heck of a lot more than it was. I still think there was over 1,000 injured. But again, that goes back to if it had been an hour earlier when all the schools were in session, it had been incalculable.
So for several days after, you were helping with kind of the rescue efforts. What about kind of a week after?
Well, if my memory serves me correctly, a week after, I'll say, not exactly a week after, but I think it was that coming Sunday was Easter, and so people were trying to have some semblance of reality, and if I'm not mistaken, another tornado warning came through then, forcing everyone to get cover. The night of the tornado, the few hours I did have at, like I said, my friend Bob's, definitely another tornado was spotted and coming towards Xenia. I remember the radio on that, but it didn't touch down. But that following week, then the steps were pretty basic and commonsensical. The immediate thing was to get the roads, passageways, so that the EMTs and firemen could get people to the hospital. And then once that was done, then it was kind of to even get bulldozers to move the rubble even further so that the Army National Guards and more people could come in and help. And so it was just, that was kind of what you would see for the next several days, just getting the debris out of the way, not removing it, because that was a whole different story. Removing the debris called for just countless big 18-ton dump trucks to be loaded with front-end loaders and excavators, and basically just picking up the remaining of Xenia, Ohio, and taking it out to the Fairborn area where most of Xenia is buried.
You were still in school at that time. When were you able to kind of get back to class? Where did you get back to class?
Well, that's a good question. So we were out of school for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3, but whoever the powers that be would not give us any kind of break on the 180-day rule, I believe it was. And so what they configured, which I thought was pretty ingenious, is Xenia High School students then would be bused to the Beaver Creek High School facility and start our schooling at 3:05 p.m. until 8:05 p.m. So Beaver Creek would let out and we would come right in. Of course, we had no lockers, we had no books, we had no curriculum. It was primarily to house us for the remainder of the year. And the junior highs did the similar thing with the junior highs in Beaver Creek. And so we got through that year, and then the next year, again, there was not enough time to build schools. So the only remaining school that withstood the tornado was Warner Junior High. And so we did the same thing. The high school went to Warner facility, and they taxied in all of these, what they called modules back then, these big trailers, and put chalkboards and made them look like classrooms. I think they could hold like 35, and 35 students would sit at the respective tables. And I forget how many modules there was. I'd say 20 at least, maybe 30, coupled with the Warner facility itself. And so high school would start at 6:05 a.m. and then end at noon. Then the junior highs, both junior highs, Central and Warner, would come in at about 12:10 p.m. and end their day. I forget when their day ended, but it was like pretty late, 5 o'clock maybe. And that's how we finished the entire year of 74-75. Everyone finished the year that way without any school in and of itself. So that was quite the experience as well. We were called Tornado, the Tornado class. 74 and 75 were both, because 74, of course, was graduating, but then 75 came in, and their last year was, not even at Xenia High School. Well, the end of 74 was at Beaver Creek. Then we were at the junior high for the remainder, because, like I said, Warner was one of 2 out of 11 schools, I think. All the others, I think, were devastated, if I'm not mistaken. So it was quite the experience. The student body itself was very resilient. We kind of, by then, knew what had happened. Xenia at that time then was a household name anywhere. I remember even 10 years after being in Bellingham, Washington State, and saying I was from Xenia, Ohio, and they would say, "Oh, the tornado," because at that time I think it was the second worst tornado in United States history. I can do some fact checks on that, but yeah, it was devastating. Of course, it wasn't just one tornado; it was multiple tornado breakouts that day of April 3rd, 74. So, and people came from all around the world to try to assess the damage, and of course, it was quickly decided it was what they call an F5, the highest or worst type of tornado, the highest velocity and damage potential. But yeah, so we all got through it, and then the battle cry that you would see on all the water towers and just about anything else was Xenia lives. And that was the mantra, the battle cry. The President of the United States came at that time, Nixon, and he made a speech. He had seen that written on a water tower, and he, I understand, said something to the effect of Xenia lives. And that was just one of the other things that tried to further solidify all the citizens. And it did. I think everybody, to the extent everybody could, stayed together. I don't know how many people moved away, but most people rebuilt and stayed. And, then of course, in 2000, was it 2000 or 2001, we had another killer tornado. So if you do the research, you'll see the Indians called this the Valley of the Winds, or the Devil Winds. There's several names that they've, because it does have a history of that, so I don't know if it's something to do with the valley or not.
And your home itself was not impacted as much by the tornado, it sounded.
That's correct. The whole plat of South Hill had some shingles removed and things like that, but not anything like the devastation that almost every other plat in Xenia suffered.
So when you were going to Beaver Creek, you were still going from your home?
Correct. Bust from our house to Beaver Creek. Of course, there were a lot of different ways that we would go to pick up everybody, and then we would go from Beaver Creek. That was the remaining of the year, so that would be April, May, June. Well, it was probably only 2 months, but it was really surreal. Everything was surreal from the time that, immediately after the tornado, and then the shock of the faces and people, like I said, wandering aimlessly. What the heck has just happened? People screaming, looking for their loved ones, and people running. And but even going back to school, when you think about it, you're going to school at 3:05 p.m., and getting out at 8, and you don't have to go back to school until 3 the next day. So, and with no books or anything, that was surreal as well. The whole thing was, but the mantra held up. Xenia lives, and it was on water towers for years. One at least for a decade. I think that was, in fact, I'm sure it was the water tower at Spring Hill Park. And don't ask me who painted them, but it wasn't sanctioned. It wasn't like the city hired painters to do it. It was civilians that climbed up there and painted Xenia lives. And there were bumper stickers everywhere that said Xenia lives. And that was one of the many things, I guess, in terms of mantras that helped everyone get by.
So it was about 3 weeks before you were back in school. Did you spend most of those 3 weeks helping with the recovery?
The first week for sure. Then once that was kind of leveled out, if you will, then the National Guard, and they may even call the Army Corps of Engineers in, had taken up the heavy lifting from there. And people that their houses were devastated, they found alternative housing for them, and pretty much the quote-unquote search and rescue period had already expired. There was no need for that. So at that point, it was really just a matter of, okay, what's going to happen? No one knew. We knew we had to finish school, but how are we going to finish school? And so everybody was in limbo. But yeah, I was still helping out. I remember getting wood and helping out people that stores were still salvageable, but they had no windows. So we would help tack wood onto their windows and things like that. But after the first week, most of the professionals, like I say, the National Guard and Army Corps, seemed to do a lot of that. Then the extricating of all of the rubble started, and that was a real sight, because like I say, you would see 20 18-ton dump trucks and big front end loaders just keep piling the rubble on and taking it 68 North 235, and then off of 235 is where most of it was dumped in a pit, and they call it, that's where Xenia is, and that was a sight. And then to see just because there were no, for example, there were no traffic lights still. There was nothing, no traffic lights, no gas stations, no stores, nothing. And you would have police and or the National Guard directing traffic on top of these big DP&L, which is electric company, spools, so that everybody could see them. I remember finally when I was able to drive through town, it was just ghost town, empty. And I remember Petula Clark's song Downtown came on, and it was kind of riveting but eerie at the same time. That song would come on when I'm seeing this ghost town, effectively. So those are the memories that echo with me. That, and every school I went to was destroyed. The church I went to, St. Bridget, was leveled. And yeah, it was an indelible experience and memory, that's for sure. I'm glad I was only 17. I think I was emotionally insulated still at that young age, and fortunately no one I knew personally had gotten killed, so that helped as well, obviously.
What did St. Bridget do? Where did they meet?
Well, they had a school. Their little school was on Trevine Road, and if I'm not mistaken, they started doing service there kind of as a temporary measure, because St. Bridget had been right at what we call 5 Points in Xenia, where right now it's like there's a barber shop, there's another church, I think it's the Nazarene Church, right where the same block that St. Bridget was on. St. Bridget took up the whole block, and right there is like where Chase Bank is and all of that. And so that was what was rebuilt there. But the church itself, that's my best recollection, that the parishioners for on the Sundays, but I don't know anybody that went to church too much immediately after, because there were no churches primarily. There were some that survived, obviously, but the best recollection immediately after, like I said, was that Easter, which was immediately following the tornado, and that had, if not I thought it was tornado conditions, and I don't know if it was actually sightings of tornadoes, but you're saying, oh God, here we go again.
How were your local friends and family affected?
I think the people, I call it adults, the adults had a heightened appreciation for it, and you would see, them crying, and then the body counts, and then when stories came out about, like I said, not to get too, explicit, but how people died and how people died trying to save their kids and all that. I remember my mom crying, profusely multiple times. And again, I was at an age where it was sad, but I don't think at that age a teenage boy totally processes things like you would if you were even 22 or 21. But that when those two National Guardmen died, that really was terrible. I mean, on top of everything else, because they were here to help. They were down in the basement of Cherry's Furniture and had a little, I don't know what kind of heat device they had, but a fire started, they couldn't get out, and that really, somehow with the human psyche, I think it was just a gut punch on everybody else. They had just come to terms with this devastating tornado leveling their city, and then these two of many, I think there were 1,000 National Guardmen, but two that then died needlessly trying to help us. That was insult to injury, and most of the adults, I think were again shell shocked and stayed in shock. Many people stayed in shock, and I think that lasted for a long time. And then you had grades, if you will, where people were then coming over the shock of seeing all this and just seeing the devastation. It's absolutely surreal to say what you saw, and people can't imagine. Okay, what do you mean that there's a bus on top of a bus that made a perfect T, and then there's a tractor trailer on top of it, or a train that's derailed from a tornado, and on and on and on, the devastation that you wouldn't believe. There were live fish found in Xenia High School from the Shawnee pond that was across the street. The water had taken the fish and the water, or the tornado had taken the water and in the fish and landed into the high school, which was devastated. And just, you know, one phenomenon after another, you would hear stories of. A straw, as a matter of fact, there's a picture of a straw, just a straw like a bale of hay, a straw that went through a DP&L light pole, which, you know, you couldn't imagine, but it went through it. And stories like that, you just marveled at. You couldn't, you know, you just thought, there's no way this could happen. And then, but yeah, I think that that summer, it's still, people were still in some grade level of shock, I think, the summer of '74. And then, you know, you start coping and, okay, Xenia lives, we're going back to school, and people that would go back to work. So yeah, it was, for me, it was a more unique experience, because I was lucky enough not to know anyone directly that had died. And I know a lot of people that were injured, but mostly just, you know, cuts and abrasions and things like that. But so that was the experience that I had from it. And like I said, things come full circle. Now I'm in the courtroom that I preside over. That was the one that when I was 17 saw all the devastation. But yeah, Xenia lives.
Your mother worked on Market Street. What did she do?
Yeah, she worked on Main Street, and that's right, fine. She worked on the second floor of what Famous Sporting Goods was, and she was back then. Of course, this was all before the internet and everything. She worked for something called the Credit Bureau, where people could call and then find out somebody's credit for loans and things like that. So it could be Penny's might call, Montgomery Ward's, of course. No one knows these places now, and banks would call, and she would give, through the research that they had, give credit scores to these individuals that were applying for loans, and that's what she did, along with several other people. But yeah, her car was totaled, and I to this day I don't know who got her home, but she worked for several other women, and they all took one vehicle. And someone was able to ferry them all home. And like I said, once I knew my mom was okay and everybody else was, then at 17 I was on my own from there. And so we went through the town as best as we could.
When did you see your mother again, if you spent the night at a friend's house?
That's a good question. I would say probably it would be April 4th, the day after the tornado, in the evening, and I hitchhiked from Arrowhead, where I'd still been. That was one of the places that was worst hit, and so a lot of time was there. So I hitchhiked, it was getting dark, so I hitchhiked from Arrowhead to South Hill, and then saw my mom, and then I don't know if I spent the night there, but the very next day I know we were up again and out trying to see if there was any other survivors, anything we could do along those lines. The curveball was that snow, because no one had gloves, because no one had expected a snow that late in April, especially an 1.5 inches snow. But we were pulling out wreckage with hands without gloves. I remember that. And my feet and my hands just almost frostbitten. But the things you remember, you know.
When was she able to get back to work?
It wouldn't have been for weeks. Fortunately for her building was right on the corner of a bank, and the safe kind of protected the buildings to some extent, and so she was able to get back to work earlier than most people. I would say within 3 weeks, I think, maybe she was back to work. 4 weeks for sure. As far as basic fundamental services, I don't know how how many days it was until we had running water, and how many days it was until we had electricity. But I think that by that Easter, I want to think we had electricity. I think, but maybe I'm, because I remember the radio broadcast of another tornado, but that probably was a battery-operated AM/FM radio, that I think about it. But it took some time, and in some places it took much longer to get the water back on and the electric back on. It just depends on, what grid you were in and how bad that grid was devastated.
In your opinion, what have been the long-term effects of the tornado for the community?
Well, you'll get a mixed bag. Some people swear to this day Xenia's never recovered from the tornado. Xenia's never the same as it would have been. And then there's some people that say the opposite, and some that say, it's a little bit of both. I guess I'm kind of in the group that would say it's a little bit of both. It could never recover the way it was, because how could you? You lost 33 citizens, thousands dead, 2 Army National Guard, people that were right there, and people immediately thereafter. They had a shock that they'll never get over. So, it's left permanent injuries and scars, no question about that. But the city planners, I thought, did a good job with, under the circumstances, to try to rebuild and try to design, because basically that's what it was at that point, city planning, because so much of the city was gone, to try to architect and design a new city and keeping the old city to the extent you could. And so I think it's recovered as well as it could have, that's for sure. Whether Xenia would have been more thriving without the tornado, who knows? I mean, because Xenia, let's face it, is moving more westwardly. But I remember well before the tornado, people saying that one day Dayton and Xenia would be connected by 35. And that was well before the tornado, and sure enough, that's happening. Just like it is with 75 with Cincinnati and Dayton, people coming together. So I think it's kind of, a guesstimate, or just a visceral opinion if someone says that it's so much worse or it's so much better or this or that. I think it's just a mixed bag.
Are there any other details about your experience you want to share?
No, I mean, I'll share this, but this probably won't make the cut because it's not subject to the topic matter, but so I was 17 for the Xenia tornado, and a year later I started with ODOT, working my way through undergrad and then law school. But at ODOT then, we went through the worst winter in terms of temperature in history, and I was right in the middle of that. That was 1977, the Great Freeze. And then the next year I was right in the middle of one of the worst snowstorm in the Miami Valley history and Ohio's history, and that was the Great Blizzard of '78, and I was plowing snow. So the funny thing, or the interesting thing is, of 3 of the greatest Ohio natural phenomenons in Ohio's history, I was right in the middle of all 3 by age 20. So I don't know what was going on, but I survived them all, and I was right in the middle of all of them, plowing snow in the Great Blizzard. That I will share with you, that phenomenon there rivaled some of the stuff I saw with the tornado. The tornado was just more devastating. Now, I've had friends, first responders, go down to Katrina, go down to other places, and I'd always say, how does it compare to the Xenia tornado? And the answer always is the same. Total devastation is total devastation. Katrina was total devastation, just a larger scale in terms of square miles, but it wasn't like it was worse in that regard, because Xenia was flattened, the Katrina area where it hit was flattened. So, that's the saying that I always hear from those guys that come back. Total devastation is total devastation.
Well, Judge Buckwalter, thank you very much for sharing your experience.
My pleasure, I appreciate it.